Morning, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us. I'd like to welcome you to the third session of the Futurecasting event that is a session co-hosted by the City of Cape Town and the EDP. And in this morning's discussion, we're going to be discussing big risk and how it impacts on the economy and our lives in the city region. And this session and the purpose of the session is to explore the changing nature of risk and outline practical ways in which the City of Cape Town can learn from recent disruptions and prepare for future shocks. And risk is the probability of an event happening, coupled with the uncertainty of the impact. The certainty that we have is that we have to face these risks. And we've all experienced in recent weeks the effect of disruptions. And over the past few years, we've experienced drought, the pandemic, fires, all sorts of risks. And we've learned from that, and we need to share our lessons so as to prepare for the future. The problem is that risks don't happen neatly one at a time, and they have a compounded impact. So we have to learn to create the networks and the relationships to be ready to deal with the unexpected. We're having input from three great speakers today, who I'll introduce in a moment. But firstly, just from a practical point of view, I'd like to ask you to put any questions or comments that you may have into the chat box, and we'll be monitoring that. The agenda for the session is that the three speakers will give their inputs, and then we'll have a time of questions and general discussion. And we'll try and address as many of your questions as possible. And if we have others, we'll follow up with them later. But firstly, I'd like to introduce our panel. Thank you very much for your time this morning. We have Gareth Morgan, who's the Director of Resilience at the City of Cape Town. Gareth has held senior leadership roles in the strategic responses to both the Cape Town drought and the COVID-19 pandemic. He holds an MSc in Environmental Change and Management from the University of Oxford, which he attended on a Rhodes Scholarship. Prior to joining the City of Cape Town, he was a Member of Parliament for 9 years. In 2020, he was a finalist in the Mail and Guardian's Greening the Future Awards. Our second panelist will be Ellen Fischert. She's the Executive Integrated Ecosystem Management for the Atlantis Special Economic Zone. Ellen is responsible for the creation and maintaining of a strong community and business relationship amongst the SEZ partners. She holds an honors degree in social work and community development and a number of small business and technology certificates. Ellen has extensive experience in small business development with a focus on social enterprises and technology. She mentors technology startups and designs community outreach programs that focus on personal development, digital literacy, and increasing employability of marginalized young women through STEM initiatives. Our third speaker is Dion van Zyl, who's the chairperson of the Western Cape Property Development Forum. And since 2011, Dion has been the chairperson of the Western Cape Property Development Forum, an NPO that addresses the challenges that face property development and construction in the Western Cape and acts as its collective voice to government. He holds a degree in architecture from the University of the Free State and a master's degree in urban design from the University of Cape Town. Currently the CEO of AL&A, a development and project management consultancy. He originally cut his teeth in the redevelopment of brownfield land with exposure to land remediation. His specific interests lie in development facilitation through a multidisciplinary approach with special emphasis on land beneficiation, precinct development, and brownfields land remediation and development. I'd like to ask Gareth to kick off. And yeah, we welcome your input, Gareth. You raised the issue of risk identification way ahead of the crowd, and we'd like to hear your thoughts on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me, Jill? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thanks, Gareth.
Good day, Jill. Thank you very much for the introduction. And good morning to my fellow panelists this morning, Ellen and Dion. It's a pleasure to share this platform with you. Yes, I do think it's important that we grow general awareness around the changing nature of risk in our city and broader environment. And you've obviously spoken about those notions of uncertainty. And increasingly, our risks are becoming layered on top of each other. And so building what I would argue improved resilience capabilities is important to addressing a wider range of risks. We cannot always predict when a particular risk may occur, and we may spend a lot of time working on those risks. So one of the arguments to make is to prepare general capabilities. I think, I use the following definition for urban resilience, and that is the capacity of individuals, communities, institutions, businesses, and systems within a city, and by that I mean the whole geographic extent of the city, to survive, adapt, and grow, and sometimes we should say thrive, no matter what kinds of chronic stresses and acute shocks they experience. And so the first really big point I want to make is that resilience is about a whole system. It has its component parts. We have to consider deeply about resilience for whom. We also have to obviously consider how different components may both positively and negatively affect the resilience of other parts of that system. But it's important that it is a whole system response. Chronic stress, in my mind, is an ongoing event that weakens the fabric of a society, so something like high unemployment or crime, whereas acute shock is a sudden, sharp event that threatens a city, for example, an earthquake or a flood. What's important to note as well is that some acute shocks can actually be slow-moving shocks. So a drought is a good example of acute shocks. What's also important to note is that sometimes shocks can actually manifest eventually as a stress. And I think the pandemic is a good example of something that manifested as a shock, but is now a stress for which we don't really know or understand how or when it will end. Cape Town has a range of plausible shock events. This was some work I did with stakeholders from business, civil society, and academia in 2018. These are shocks which feature prominently in the Cape Town resilience strategy, with the exception of actually the pandemic. We never had pandemic as a prioritized shock in Cape Town. There were, of course, disaster management response plans for a pandemic, but it didn't feature. These are a range of stresses which are relevant in Cape Town, and on the right is a vulnerability map. That vulnerability map layers over 40 indicators, including crime, violence, distance from police stations, distance from emergency services, access to livelihoods and jobs. There are about 40 indicators behind that show the extent to which various parts of Cape Town are vulnerable or not. And one of the key ways, of course, to improve resilience is to decrease our vulnerability. So there are a wide range of stresses, largely as a legacy of colonialism and apartheid in South Africa. And there are some stresses there which are highlighted, like trauma, which are particularly relevant in a city like Cape Town, where there are high degrees of anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, from being victims of crime or through living through the impacts of apartheid. This was some work that I did with stakeholders in 2018 as well. There's both a qualitative and quantitative profile for Cape Town. This qualitative profile has 156 indicators behind it, and identifies that some of the key resilience challenges, if we were to group them in Cape Town, are a lack of empowered stakeholders, and that is really information in order for people to be able to assess their own risk and to take action within their own means. A lack of social cohesion and community identity, largely as a legacy of colonialism and apartheid. That doesn't mean that there isn't high community cohesion often within communities, but there is less of a cohesion across different communities in Cape Town. and high crime and violence is a particularly large resilience challenge. The quantitative profile, which includes 120 quantitative data points, particularly highlights the issue of high unemployment in Cape Town, which as of the start of this, end of the first quarter of this year, stood at 528,000 people, much higher, of course, than the beginning of last year. But it is perpetually a high and sticky unemployment figure. So those four things are big resilience challenges which need to be turned around in order to decrease vulnerability and subsequently improve resilience. Cape Town Resilience Strategy focuses on a range of actions that seek to address improving resilience. And it's important to note that it has 75 actions, but of course the actions we all take, whether it be business, civil society, government or individual households, collectively builds that resilience. Those previous slides is the collective resilience of the whole of the city, inclusive of all systems, people, and households. As of the end of June this year, 43 of those actions are implemented and ongoing. 4 are implemented and concluded, 12 are in early implementation, and the remainder are conceptualized, piloted, on hold, or have not started. These are a range of, just a collection of actions I chose for this presentation. And the key point about resilience actions really in my mind is to have co-benefits. They may very well have one primary goal, but to try and achieve other goals as well. I mean, an example I could pick here is in the top line, walking buses. I mean, walking buses are now instituted in a range of communities around Cape Town. The principal goal of getting children safely to school, particularly in high gang areas. But during the recent period of social unrest alert, when Cape Town was preparing for the possibility of increased social unrest, there was a co-benefit of those walking buses able to occupy space in various parts of Cape Town in an attempt to protect particularly assets in our food system. Another key part, of course, of resilience is the ability to simulate and respond to potential threats through simulation. And so, for example, in the last year, there's been a significant simulation around responding to a nuclear event. We're the only city in Africa with a nuclear power station. But every month in Cape Town, there are a range of simulations around particularly building evacuation for settlement fire that go on. And of course, there's potential for a lot more. Perhaps one point to make is that the exploration of possible new insurance products is also a very important point that we are pursuing. Currently, at least for the government of the city of Cape Town, there's a general insurance fund and access to a municipal insurance facility. But there might be, and of course it's complex in terms of municipal law, the opportunity to also explore municipal catastrophe bonds. So for example, for a catastrophic drought, where of course there could be an insurance payout. That's work we've been doing with the World Bank, and there are a few examples in Africa, not many. These insurance tools are commonly used in the United States and Europe, and particularly in the US, for insurance against hurricanes and the like. One of the things that I try and work on as much as possible within my own organization is to build the capabilities of resilience. Because if you can't predict or be ready for every possible event, I mean, of course, with capital infrastructure, you can build and renew and so on, but sometimes you won't have things in place. And so these are some of the capabilities that I've been trying to grow practices around with staff in my own organization, but also with partner organizations. And those are reflective learning, systems mapping, adaptive management, strong data products, and strong project and portfolio management. Reflective learning is that practice of whether in a shock event or after a shock event, taking the time to actually understand what happened, what went wrong, what could be better, so that when similar shock events happen again, you're in a better position, of course, to have learned from the past. Interestingly enough, when the pandemic started, we actually pulled out the reflective learning work from the drought in order to reflect on that, because both are system-wide shock events, and there was a lot to learn. Of course, a big project that many of you will be aware of is the reflective learning exercise on the drought, which the city worked in partnership with Peter Willis on. which captured 39 one-hour interviews of people from business, civil society, and government who made decisions in the drought, which is a big resource for decision makers going forward. Another key capability which I'm trying to grow with colleagues, staff, and partners is system mapping, the ability to see a whole system and to understand the component parts of that system and the roles in that system for periods of significant disruption. And this, for example, is some work we have done on the food system as well, which was particularly useful in preparation for social unrest a few weeks ago, where we were able to rapidly map 1,400 food points in the city, including distribution warehouses, grocery stores, and the like, all put on GIS mapping in order to make particular choices around how the system could be protected if social unrest arose in the city. Fortunately, it didn't. Adaptive management is important management capability. We learned it's hard from the drought and have committed ourselves to improving this. It's a big organization that doesn't always move fast. And so being able to train staff with the ability to be able to work with complex problems is an important capability for any organization trying to navigate particularly uncertainty in a rapidly changing environment. So working with the EDP, we've created a methodology. Over 200 staff have been trained in this already, and we've now included this recently as a minimum competency for all managers in the city, and we'll be taking staff through this training in the future. Strong data products are important as well, the ability to make informed decision. On the screen is an example of a product that we created at the start of the pandemic, which is a vulnerability viewer layered with dozens and dozens of potential ways to look at the city. This particular vulnerability viewer has the ability to look at downscaled COVID cases in communities, but also has the ability to map areas of potential risk in the city, and behind it has a vulnerability index which looks at the extent to which particular areas are less or higher in vulnerability. And that has been used extensively by our community-based teams as well as disaster management teams to direct limited resources during the pandemic. I think it has significant legacy impact for a much wider range of responses in the future. And then I think what we've learned as well, both in the drought and in the pandemic, is having a mature and maturing project program and portfolio management system is important to respond to a range of droughts, a range of shocks and stresses. One of our significant successes during the pandemic was to be able to build 39 clinic overflow facilities in a matter of 8 weeks in the early stages of the pandemic last year to allow for improved social distancing. And of course, to make sure that the general provision of primary health care was not disrupted by the ongoing trajectory of the pandemic. That's a significant legacy and the largest investment into primary health care in the city in over 2 decades. But what we're also working on now, in a project which I'm predominantly focused on, is the integration of resilience screening into capital management processes. We are in the process of finalizing 10-year capital management plans, which will likely guide an investment of over 70 billion rand over the next 10 years. It's important for us to know what the resilience benefits of those, particularly for analysis purposes, to understand what shocks and stresses are we not sufficiently responding to. So, for example, there's a 6 billion rand investment into water augmentation over the next 5 years, but are we investing sufficiently enough in other potential shock events, including community flooding, as well as coastal events such as storm surges? And so this will give us a tool that will allow us to regularly send messages to sector planners to develop new projects for consideration. We've also now built in a new program for project managers, of which we have several hundred, to be able to think through the impacts of shocks and stresses during the point of execution of their projects, from the day the project starts to the day the project is commissioned, with a risk rating to allow them to understand the level of planning that they have to do. So those are some of the capabilities that I think are generally applicable. We can't obviously predict every single shock event, but of course we need to respond to the ones that are most plausible. But for those that we don't, building general capabilities that are useful in any shock events is, I think, a very good way of responding to the uncertainty of our future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gareth. That is very informative, and I think there'll be lots of questions in the discussion. I'm going to move to Ellen, who has the challenge of integrating the ecosystem of private investment and community building in the Atlantis SEZ. So over to you, Ellen.
Thank you, Jill. I hope you can all hear me and that you can see my screen. I'm just putting on my timer just so that I don't go over time, because if you allow me, I will speak forever. So good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for making time to join us this morning on a Friday morning to talk about relatively abstract concepts and at the same time very important and concepts for our economy and therefore our people. I started about 6 months ago at the Atlantis Special Economic Zone, and I would like to take you through some of the learnings in the past 6 months that speak to the concept of resilience, but not necessarily using that word. And it's sort of like integrated with my experience as a social worker at the beginning of my career, a good 22 plus years ago. And since 2009, I've been working in the technology sector and in different roles, so setting up incubators in the Eastern Cape. And since, well, I suppose the beginning of this year, have moved from working solely into technology and bringing back community because I realized in the 10 years I was working in technology that technology does not solve all problems. Sorry, I'm just trying to move to my next slide. Okay, there we go. So as Jill mentioned, the title that I have at the Atlantis Special Economic Zone is Integrated Ecosystem Executive. And it's a very long title, and no one has any idea what it means. And it took me a long time to figure out as well what that means. And some days I get it right, and some days I get it wrong. I chose these images because it speaks to the different touch points, the different entities, the different communities, the different individuals that I speak to. And if you look at the picture on the top left-hand corner, that's me with 7 million different thoughts, and also often conflicting and all very urgent requests and requirements. Basically, what it means in my role within the Special Economic Zone, as we try and as we are busy bringing investment into the Western Cape for green technology companies, positioning the Western Cape as the green hub of Africa. It means that everyone wants to jump onto that bandwagon. Everyone has different interpretations of what that means. And there are many, many, many examples and initiatives that are running not only in the province, in the country, but also on the continent. And my role is to try and bring the different voices together so that we have an integrated approach and that it makes sense. So most of the days we speak about infrastructure, and with the objectives of today's session, I thought I'd share with you. I suppose I don't have to with most of you, but let's assume that not everyone is equally versed with what economic development means. Let's assume that not everyone works within the infrastructure sector. And also the objective of the Special Economic Zone is to build infrastructure. And we know that historically throughout the world, economic development usually happens when there's infrastructure development taking place. So a couple of years ago, I remember attending a session on infrastructure development. It was specifically in ICT, and one of the speakers said, how do you judge economic development in a country? You judge it by the amount of cranes that you see in a city. hence my picture of the cranes, because we know when there's building, it means there's money flow, it means people are working, we know that it means that there's new things coming. And in South Africa, we are good at setting visions, especially strategic visions. We are good at, I would suppose, thinking about what we would like the world to look like. And we are especially good at comparing ourselves and sometimes I think, unfortunately, trying to implement very abstract concepts, very faraway concepts into our local context that is not always ready for it, or this, is sort of like infrastructure doesn't benefit everyone. So when we talk about infrastructure in the, in the workplace of the special economic zone, we're talking about civil infrastructure, we're talking about roads. I've learned such a lot about water and energy, things I never knew before, how sewage pipes work, how systems are all interconnected from a very tangible way, and also that speak to, very logical systems, very logical plans. There's all sorts of budgets attached to that. And this is the language we speak on a daily basis. We speak it to the community, we speak it to each other, we speak it to potential investors, and that is our focus, to bring economic development. Myself being the integrated ecosystems executive, and basically that means the person in charge of herding the cats, because we know where people are concerned, there's a lot of complexity. And when we want to get to efficient and effective systems, it means that we need to collaborate. And it's a word that all of us like to use, but it is an incredibly, incredibly difficult action to undertake. And so what I want to speak about today is also another part of infrastructure, and that's social infrastructure. And essentially, social infrastructure speaks to, again, buildings. It speaks to medical facilities, educational facilities. It speaks to ensuring that there's water and energy for people, because we know when they have access to these basic facilities, health improves. They have better means to take care of themselves at homes. People can charge their laptops and their phones. Their kids can potentially navigate the internet to get access to the Google Drive documents for the schools that work with Google Docs and who don't have, very expensive and learning management systems. It speaks to food security. It speaks to many things that Gareth actually spoke about in his presentation. It's good to see that, my presentation was on track, or what I'm trying to do is what the general thinking, and not myself and the team. But social infrastructure also means a conducive environment. And when we speak about environment, we're talking about our direct environment. So where we live, how we are able to get to our jobs, or and if we can't get to the jobs, how do we get to places where we can create economic opportunities for ourselves. But it also speaks to matters such as safety and security. So the walking buses that Gareth refers to is actually not abstract, it's very real. And when you work in community and enterprise and skills development, you're often seen as the person who's responsible for the soft stuff. But the soft stuff is the basis for all of the hard stuff that we're doing. So those are our physical infrastructure, buildings and systems that I referred to earlier. And something also that I want to mention that's very important is internet access. We all know that none of us or our kids can live without internet access and ICT systems. It is no different for people in townships and informal economies and the great number of unemployed people in our country. So a comparison I would like to make, and because we're speaking about resilience and risk, is talking about community assets. So what we tend to do very well as experts is to point out the problems. And as Jill mentioned at the beginning of the session, what we're trying to talk about today and hopefully continue that conversation is what do solutions look like? So I don't need to tell you about the problems that we have in our country, and that includes our communities. We all know about that. What I'd like to talk about, or hopefully stimulate some thought on, is how do we see each other as equals. So if we look at, and I'd like to use the neighborhood example. And on the one hand, you have a neighborhood and it's this connected system, because it means that we're usually like-minded people from a perspective of what we earn, what we aspire in life, what we feel is acceptable in terms of our living environment. And that's my time. Just going to try and finish quickly here. We have shared interests. We invest in ensuring that we have the right kind of assets. So that means, we have schools, we have access to healthcare, we have shops, we have safe roads, and we're usually people that are committed to protecting that environment. And there is no difference actually between communities that seek to achieve these, that seek to build a life as we do outside of these grassroots communities, and actually in business as well. So in my 11, 12 years working in the tech startup ecosystem of South Africa, when you work with startups, they have the exact same principles. They're looking for like-minded people that will either purchase their products, and they're looking to connect and share opportunities with businesses. They understand the importance of assets that could either be their physical infrastructure, their hosting services, their abilities to develop technology and to deploy them, and connection, and having like-minded people that action, that drive marketing, that drive sales. There's no difference between that business setting, the tech startup setting, or actually a community setting. Gareth spoke a lot about, just a new approach that is not a nice to have, but I think it's a critical condition for resilience. So as a social worker, many years ago, 2+ decades ago, I learned about systems thinking, and that was very much focused on how you bring about, how you implement interventions in families, and you see whoever the problem child or problem parent is, or maybe problem neighborhood, you see them in a bigger context. And I always like using this image because it gives us a good understanding of how we need to move from our individual expertise that we all have, and all of us sitting in the community, sitting in this call, but also communities. They are very expert and professional people. They know very well how to survive. They know very well how to get up every day and hustle to either, get a way of being able to buy gas or wood to keep their houses warm, or to cook, how to hustle for food every day, and maybe also find the odd job or two. So they have systems, we have systems, and the idea is that we move away from siloed thinking, we move away from this disconnectedness, and really focus on working in the system and understanding that, we all of these parts that we are form some of the whole. These are South African examples of startups that I'd like to share with you. And the interesting thing about these startups is that they work on the intersectionality of very much for profit, and they are businesses, but they're social enterprises. They work within technology, and what they've done is actually use the principles of understanding that you can either decide to sell to a very niche market, or you can decide to solve problems for a very small group of people, or you can access the masses and use very new and innovative business models. So for example, Kula is an app. They just received about 17 million Rand investment from NSFAS about a week or 2 weeks ago. And what it is it's an integration app that allows smallholder farmers to actually add their goods, their fresh produce to a system every day. They get trained in how to grow their agricultural goods. And what Kula actually does is collect all of these inputs and sells them. And they do this on a very easy platform. If we look at Pineapple and Naked Insurance, they are actually using the principle of trust and about communities, and are not trying to inflate prices for people, but are actually ensuring that everyone has access to insurance, because we know what it's like, when your laptop or your phone or whatever gets stolen, but most of us will recover. When your fridge gets stolen, or if you even have a fridge, or when your phone is stolen in different communities, the impact is enormous, and it could take you months to years to recover, or you never ever recover. And the last picture at the bottom is from our labs in Cape Town. They have a currency that is called Zlato, and it is based on actually public and private partners coming together. So them as an NGO that focus on community empowerment have actually partnered with provincial government, but also a couple of private sector partners or corporates, I would say, to encourage positive community behavior, and they are rewarded with tangible goods such as data and ShopRite vouchers. It worked very well when COVID hit, that people could actually still access food, and just working through this principle. So there's definitely room for infrastructure development and for us to bring innovation to that. My last slide is really just about some of the terms that seem somewhat polarized. So the economics of all of this, when we're looking at resilience, when we're looking at community assets, and we're looking at infrastructure development, is to use the same principles for community development. We know that when we're doing capital investment, or when we're building an economic zone, we're looking at 10, 15, 20 years investment. This is no different for communities. And we have to move away from looking only at short-term benefits, KPIs for the year. We need to think about questions like, are we building pipelines to prisons, or are we thinking of the long-term investment where we actually have a philosophy of supporting people from cradle to college? We know, and it's proven in the stats, that public and private and partnerships really equal the best value for your investment and for your money. And I'd also like to point out the common denominator between business and communities, that they're equally human. The humans make the decisions. Dividends is something that people like to talk about. What's the return on investment? When will we get our dividends? You can't get dividends if there is no dignity, because if people don't have dignity, they will take away from who they feel have too much dividends, or if it's not equally divided. And also I'd like us to, when we think about the concepts of resilience, to think about best practices in this poly crisis. There's not one crisis happening at the world, so there cannot be one solution, and there cannot be one expert. I'm hoping that this very long conversation has inspired you to, when you think about the new normal, to also think about the new economy and new economics. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellen. That is great. And I think you clearly made the point that the best insurance that we have against risk is the soft stuff, the building of social capital, to protect the hard infrastructure and investment, and that collaboration is key, and we need to see each other as partners if we're going to achieve this timeline of 10 to 20 years investment. So I'd like to hand over to Dion now. Dion, it's all over to you.
Great. Thanks, Jill. Good morning to everybody, fellow panelists, Gareth and Ellen, but also all the familiar faces. Just scrolling down the attendance list. Good to see everybody. Yeah, I think I'm not going to be showing slides. I'm going to be talking to a couple of points, partly in response to what my fellow panelists have said, but also just reflecting from a very specific perspective on the concept of resilience. Yeah, to qualify, I think it's important to state up front, the lens that I'm looking at the debate through is one of property development, built environment consultancy and construction, basically the eyes of contractors and the teams that they employ. My world does not just serve the private sector. It doesn't just serve the commercial sector. It also serves society through government projects, specifically the consultancy and the construction capacity that we bring to the party. But fundamentally, my world is about change, right? It is about changing the status quo to something else. And by default, it is about growth. So when one engages on the topic of resilience, the question is really, is it a pro-change and a pro-growth discussion? Or is it the classical definition of resilience, the ability to return to a previous shape, the ability to recover? Because by default, the definition in a way says that which we had is what we aspire to return to. And perhaps being a little bit contrarian, I think really the question that we've got to ask ourselves is, do we actually want to go back to what we had? Was what we had prior to this crisis actually working? Was it ideal? And again, wearing the lenses that I do, I've got to say, I don't think we want to go back to the world that we had prior to this crisis, because that is not sustainable. It cannot survive in the previous format. So, you know, the classical definition, capacity to recover from difficult times, or the ability of a substance or an object to spring back to its original shape. Nah, I want to change the definition today. And that is, resilience in our perspective is, will we survive? So by default, let's talk about, will we survive, and what is the context that we function in? It was a Churchill that said, never let a good crisis go to waste. And I think we've got a number of fantastic crises right now in South Africa that we're either going to use to our absolute benefit to the future of our society, our country, and by default, our city, or we're going to be looking back in years to come and say, we wasted the crisis. Prof. Mohale, the Chancellor of the University of Free State and also a recent guest at one of our virtual conferences, made the statement. He said, if policy writing was an Olympic sport, South Africa would be winning every gold medal. And I think that's unfortunately extremely true. We love policy writing. We've got a machine producing legislation, and very often excellent first world legislation, totally irrelevant to the conditions that we're experiencing in South Africa. If I look, and again, not having a go at the city, but you know, we are having this discussion in context of the city of Cape Town. When the last did we truly do introspection on the policy and legislative framework that governs our local society, Cape Town society? And the answer is, we don't do that. We don't like doing it because it feels like self-criticism. And in fact, the ability to be self-critical is in fact the ability to be resilient. And if you're not open to criticism, and if you don't engage with your partner structure around you, your society, your end users, and critically question the environment that one creates through government, then by default, you are not being resilient. And I think that is in essence the argument that my sector, my industry would put on the table. So, you know, is it a question of planning to be resilient in future, or is true resilience asking, well, how are we doing things right now? And is the way that we're doing things right now actually going to allow us all to survive? So how can Cape Town use the crisis to become resilient? I think we've got to just stop and ask ourselves, what is the crisis? Okay, so obviously the crisis is COVID and the fact that we're all talking to each other via an incredible platform called Zoom. And well, maybe there's an opportunity in this crisis. What is this crisis called state capture offers? right? Well, it's caused us to reflect on our legislative system. It has caused us to reflect on the ability of all three spheres of government, specifically the so-called portfolio committee structure, to actually oversee governance. And I think we've got to conclude that at a constitutional level, we have a problem, because the system that we created to oversee governance on a daily basis is not working. Portfolio committees are not working in Parliament. Gareth has had 9 years experience in Parliament, and I'd like to hear his comment on it. It is perhaps not working at province, and we know as we sit, it is not working in the city of Cape Town. How do we know it's not working in the city of Cape Town? Well, quite simply, let's look at the technical expertise that sits in a portfolio committee. If you're not qualified to be able to understand the technical jargon that officials are putting on the table on a daily basis and interrogate whether the same Gantt chart has been presented 60 times already and with no change, well, then there's a problem, right? If you're not asking critical questions of the performance of the technocrats, who are very well qualified and, you know, specialists in their own rights, how do you actually do oversight? So I think there is a wonderful opportunity to ask ourselves, is our oversight structure resilient to be able to survive? The economic crisis, right, where we're sitting right at the moment, you know, the blood is on the walls. There's a reason why we're seeing extremely few cranes out there, Ellen. Right? But what is that opportunity? Well, maybe we should be asking ourselves, do we make it too difficult for cranes to be erected in the first place? Why does it take you 2.5, 3 years' time to get your statutory application processes in place to only then break land? You know, why does my industry see government as one of the biggest risks right now, if not the biggest risk? And does that, in fact, you know, are we seeing few cranes purely just because of the economy, or are there opportunities out there that can just not be serviced because the framework and the environment that we've created is in fact anti-change, change being a nuisance, not an opportunity? So yeah, let's look at other crises, pouring pure sewage into our river system, right? And well, that is a crisis, right? Potsdam, Makassar, and others, but what is the opportunity? The opportunity is to say, should we continue running Victorian-type sewage work treatment plants that take 5 years to plan and another 5 years to construct? Or should we have a strategy of package plants throughout the city? Should we have a strategy of water reutilization? Should we have a strategy of absolute creative thinking? Because at the moment, we are still following the Victorian sewage treatment plant with minor tweaks strategy. Let's look at the amount of land that is being sterilized by our Victorian sewage works. Last time I checked, Athlone Sewage Works, I think, sterilizes 50 hectares of land. That is 100 rugby fields in probably one of the best located parts of the metropolitan area. Should it not be the new CBD of Cape Town? So again, the crisis out there, are we wasting the crisis, or are we grabbing the crisis to change versus to revert what we knew before? What are we doing with the taxi war at the moment? You know, Marcella's from South America, and I spent some time in Bolivia looking at La Paz, where they embrace the taxi industry as the core component of their public transport network. Are we going to try and aspire to revert back to a rail system that we knew in the 60s, 70s, and 80s? Or are we going to use the opportunity to re-embrace an existing system and respect the taxi industry for once? Those are the challenges. Housing crisis. You know, I can go on forever. Are we going to use the debate on inclusionary housing as a tax or as an opportunity? Are we going to use this as the opportunity to release government land on a pragmatic basis for the development of inclusionary housing? Or are we going to say, not in my backyard, we want to keep it as it was in the past? So for me, resilience is not about reverting and returning to what we knew in the past. It is really about saying, for the first time, what is Cape Town 2050 going to look like? Because it can't look like it used to. It cannot function like it used to. It cannot have systems that are really not designed for change and delivery. Okay, so let's just reflect on the role of government. In a perfect world, and there are examples, we can look at the British systems and we can look perhaps even Italy to some extent. If government is slick and well-defined and focused on its true core business, then government has the ability to be the proverbial keel of the sail yacht, that weight at the bottom, the ballast, that keeps the ship reasonably orientated in a storm, all right? Because that's its purpose, is just to make sure that the thing doesn't tip, right? In a perfect world, that is what government should be doing. But that means it is focused on its core business, right? Making minimum interventions, maximum benefits. But if government is structured to do 55 other things, which is not core business, well, it just loads weight to the exercise and the boat is guaranteed to flip over, right? So the danger of government lies in inefficiencies, costs, slowness, lack of creativity, a culture of rule through auditor versus rule by service delivery. And I think these are the questions that my industry at the moment is looking for serious debate on. We've got to ask ourselves, are we running a system that partners with growth and change, or is growth and change treated as a nuisance, an unfortunate nuisance that just needs to be tolerated? So, if one then stands back and says, okay, so let's ask ourselves, are we resilient as a city? Then again, and forgive me for sounding critical, I've got to ask the questions blatantly. I've got to say, do we need 33,000 employees in a local authority? Do we need a salary bill of 15.7 billion rand, right? Can we tolerate the underspending of CapEx? CapEx being the future, being the infrastructure that will address future. Can we tolerate the fact that if you look at the organogram of the city, the number of staff tasked with facilitating change and growth is minuscule? Last time I looked, I think land use planning has only got 1.3% of the staff contingent of the city. Right? So if we talk about change and growth, we're actually paying lip service purely based on the way that the city is structured at the moment. The other question we've got to ask is, what are the KPIs of the executive management of the city? City manager and the executive directors of the city. How many of them are truly tasked with growth and job creation? And I couldn't find, at the top 2 levels in the city, I could not find a single KPI that speaks to growth and job creation, i.e. change. So is the city resilient? I think it's not. Are we planning to be resilient? Well, if we want to be resilient, we've got to deal with some of these tough questions. And I think we mustn't waste a crisis. What we mustn't do is say to each other, we want to go back to what we were before. Because what we were before is not addressing the needs of society. It is not addressing the needs of the market. It's not addressing what we really want. So how do we go about it? Well, for me, it's actually quite simple. I had a look at what the Constitution says, Section 152 of the Constitution, on the role of local authority. And this is generic. This is not just for Cape Town. We should be willing to do introspection in every municipality in the Western Cape and ask ourselves, is it providing a democratic and accountable government to local community? Yes or no, right? What is local community? We can analyze all of those things. It's not just about the election. Are we actually accountable? Are we providing the services that communities can be sustainable? And that's bulk infrastructure. It is future planning. It is the proportional of money in the budget that we're actually spending on these factors. Are we promoting social and economic development? Well, if the third clause of 152, section C, promotes social and economic development, if I cannot find a KPA in the top management structure of the city that deals with social and economic development, we've got a crisis. To promote a safe and a healthy environment. Well, we are running a private army, 6,000 people in the private army in the city, but is it actually preventing change? Is it there to keep things the way they were? Because then it's not money being very well spent. To encourage the involvement of communities and community organizations. Ellen spoke about partnership. Right now, are we dealing with the NGOs and the industry bodies as partners or as nuisances? Are we allowing them to initiate new policy and thinking, or are we asking our partners to only respond to the to the thinking that took place internally in the organization? I think maybe it's time to have a serious public debate on what policies and regulations does industry and NGO and society groupings want to see. I've never been asked in my 10 years as the chairperson of the Western Cape Property Development Forum, what would you like us to do? That conversation doesn't take place. The conversation is, we have thought the following to be a good idea. What do you think? We are punch drunk. We are suffering under public participation fatigue, right? And I don't think it's time being very well spent. So, yeah, so in summary, Jill, if we talk about resilience, I think the core question for me is, resilient to what purpose? If it is to revert to the original shape, I think we've got a big problem. If it is using this crisis, and I mentioned a couple of our crises at the moment, to change the fundamental way we are doing things, to slick down, simplify the ballast role of government on the ship called Cape Town, then I think we've got a wonderful opportunity. So yeah, open to the discussion. Thanks.
Thanks, Dion. I think, yep, there's a lot in there that we can discuss now, and the task of changing culture in order to survive is a challenge that we all need to embrace. I'd like to encourage everybody who's on this call to put your questions into the chat, and we'll ask the panelists to respond to them. But first, I'd like to ask Gareth and Ellen and Dion to respond to the points that you've all raised. But let's just start with Dion's questions about changing the culture. I see the need to change our institutional arrangements and partnering. I see that within your resilience strategy, Gareth. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I'm happy to comment on that. Yeah, so I mean, important for me is resilience is not just about survival, it's about adaptation as well. And the adaptation suggests a pathway to something that is new. I wholeheartely agree with Dion from where I sit in the city that returning to anything like we were doesn't make sense. But the more important part of that is it is not sustainable. It wasn't sustainable before, and it is increasingly not sustainable. The very nature of the city is changing fundamentally. It is an informalizing city. I mean, the projections of population growth the forecasts are 1.6%. There may very well be a scenario that is increasingly bigger if the remnants of or the impacts of state failure and a wider range of B municipalities in South Africa comes to pass. Migration events to urban areas may very well increase beyond forecasts. So the adaptation and the embracing certainly of increasingly the role and the opportunity of the informal side of the city is going to be big, and you referenced the taxi side. I personally agree with that as well. It is the most resilient response to transport actually in the city. It is the net that obviously works when other forms of transport fail for whatever reasons. On the response directly that you asked me, Dion, on oversight, yeah, I agree. I mean, I spent a considerable amount of time performing an oversight role predominantly around water, environment, and to some extent health in my own time there. I like to think I performed that admirably because, of course, I took it very, very seriously, becoming a legislative expert on every area I worked on. But that is not commonly the case. Oversight is generally very, very weak in South Africa. And holding the government to account is not something that is strong enough. I mean, I think it was much stronger in the periods of 1994 to approximately 2000, 2001, but got substantially weaker. But the key point I want to say to response to Dion is that the adaptation side is vitally important. I think it's also important to maybe just make one or two brief comments around the difference between resilience and sustainability. I think sustainability sets for ourselves the long-term goals of a city. I don't think it is any institution, organization, or system's goal in life to be resilient. That is not a good enough goal. The best goal, of course, is to be sustainable, and we can build out that particular thing. Resilience, in my mind, allows us to get back on track to a higher order goal when we may get knocked off of that track. So I don't think it should be anyone's primary goal to be resilient. And I think in some cases, when we consider the resilience of, it is perhaps insulting to be able to say to parts of a system, oh, you're so resilient, because I mean, particularly say, for example, people living in informality. People don't want to just be resilient. But unfortunately, resilience is a key part of building a system that is able to obviously cope and to get back onto a track. But I agree, Dion, we can't go back to what we were, and using the crisis is vitally important. From where I stand, some of those capabilities that I'm attempting to grow amongst colleagues are an attempt to obviously see that system in a different way and to acknowledge the fact that it in itself is vulnerable.
Thanks, Gareth. I see Heidi saying, you know, how do you become part of the change makers? Ellen, can you give us any thoughts on the entry points for becoming part of the change? The city is a partner in the SEZ. You've been in talks with Dion. You know, how do you make the connections in order to partner and make these changes?
Thanks, Jill, and thanks for the question, Heidi. I love the question because it's a very practical one. What that means is you need to have a lot of patience and a six-pack, because as Gareth and Dion have both said, is that, you know, change is well, in government structures we move very slowly. But I suppose just a very direct and a practical response to your question is to take note of, you know, some of the comments that you've heard today, and I suppose the insights that you've heard today, and to connect. I mean, yesterday I was in a meeting with Dion, and I loved his closing statement earlier about no one's ever asked me. So I tend to complain in certain meetings that no one's asking the community, or no one's asking me, who has the smallest budget and, you know, is always at the bottom of the list of priorities. So it's usually when we need a nice, you know, community project, then let's bring in Ellen. And I say this with all due respect to my partners and colleagues and employers. I say this simply because, you know, it requires one to view the world differently if you want a different outcome. So sometimes, a start to this, Heidi, and for myself as well, I saw on the one slide that Gareth had about, the different initiatives that they have, the resilient strategies and food security and all of these things. And for example, we are about to re-advertise an RFQ for a food security system. So I know that the person I'm emailing after this call is Gareth, because why would I try and recreate something in Atlantis where they have got tons of experience? They've, the city has invested money in research and work groups, and they've probably, and I know the resilience team has done a lot with regards to food security. So I think practically for me, it's what is it the work that you do, Heidi? What are the outcomes that you need to achieve in terms of your KPAs? And how could you just reach out to a person and say, what are you doing in this regard? So when we're talking about infrastructure development and things like that, I know I need to reconnect with Dion, because ultimately we both have a shared vision, but we may speak different language and we may have different means or vehicles or paths of achieving that. So I think it very practically as individuals, it requires that self-reflective ability and the hard work of acknowledging that, okay, we just spent 6 months working on this and it didn't have the return on investment. Are we willing to admit that, or are we going to keep pushing that we've achieved this KPI or that it looks good in reports? So I think it's about daring to reflect. It's about reaching out and being vulnerable and saying, I don't know how to do this, or how does this make sense in your language or in your world, and just doing it, really. Because if you're going to wait for a policy or strategy or an incentive from your employer or just your work stream that's going to tell you this is how we do it, you're going to do, it's going to take you a long time. So use your intrinsic, I suppose, maybe desire to change and connect with like-minded people, and we start incrementally.
Thanks, Ellen. Dion, Jessica's put a note in the chat there that she appreciated your reframing of resilience and public participation and partnerships, but there's a need for a hard look at growth. And what does economic inclusion look like, given that growth is extremely entangled with climate change, resource depletion, and pollution? So can you respond to that, Dion?
Yeah, I think, Jill, before I do on that, the one thing that I need to just put on the table as well is, it's very easy for people like myself to throw darts at government, because my world is about change and government's world is actually about an oil tanker that chugs along at 1 or 2 knots an hour. But at the end of the day, growth is a reality. I mean, let's just take what do I mean by growth? Well, let's just start with the basics. Gareth referred to urbanization. Urbanization is a reality, right? It's not going to, nowhere else in the world has urbanization stopped because of policy, because of legislation, okay? So again, it's either a nuisance that we will be a city of probably 7 or 8 million people before, I retire one day, or it's an opportunity, okay? Growth doesn't mean more of the same either, right? Growth means by default, how many people still need a 300 or 400 square meter house? Changing our mindset towards micro apartments or a city pad and a rural pad is also part of the growth discussion. Growth is also about using less water through new technology. So growth, I think we've got to be very careful when we use the term, because I think the average person out there would probably say, okay, growth means more of the same, right? And then the capitalists like myself or the free marketeers like myself abuse it and say, well, we've got to give our shareholders return. That's not growth. There's a fascinating piece of this morning in the New York Times. They've just for the first time realized that metabolic changes there are 4 basic phases in the human body. I was fascinated. The first phase is the first year of growth of a baby, and that's directly related to the cell production. The second phase is up to the 20s, and they think it is related to the brain development. Then from about 20 to about 60, there's no change in your metabolic rate in general terms, of course, the individual. And then from about 60, it starts to change. Now, for the first time, they know these things, right? So what am I saying? Growth has got a purpose, right? It is the purpose to take a baby from a newborn to a toddler. It's got the purpose to take brain development from a stage up to the 20s. It has got a purpose across the median period, and then, of course, the slowdown. Now, how do we deal with growth in that sense? Growth must be and I'm going to interrupt myself, my train of thought. I had the privilege of reading Rwanda's business plan. Their vision document was published in the year 2000. They have not published a new growth strategy. It's the same 36-odd page document that 20 years later is still being used. The only thing that they've published is their own critical review on their performance against the 6 pillars that they set out for themselves 20 years ago. Right? So have they grown? Of course they've grown. Have they grown their policy and legislative environment? They've actually reduced it. Because one of their pillars says that the private sector is a fundamental partner in achieving our vision. What is hindering the private sector's performance? And they've systematically set about removing some of the, I mean, we all know about the medical drones. Now, in a question of 6 months, they changed all legislation and policy to facilitate medical drones. What have we removed? Because growth also means cutting away the unnecessary tentacles. It also means reshaping towards resilience and efficiency. That's also growth, right? So growth is not just this expanding amoeba that just becomes bigger and then bigger. It actually speaks fundamentally, as I just referred to the New York Times article, to the ability to survive, right? And then I must again sound critical. If I look at the staff growth of this organization called the City of Cape Town, it is an amoeba growing bigger and bigger and bigger. Not multicellular, it just bloats, right? So growth also means the ability to look at yourself critically and cut away what is not really core business. And I think that debate is probably the biggest opportunity that we've ever had. Now, let's also be fair. There is this thing called not in my backyard, NIMBYs, right? And any politician out there would say their biggest nightmare at night is what are the NIMBYs going to say? Why? Because the NIMBYs keep them in power. They elect them, right? Very few people vote for change, for the uncomfortable dimensions of change. Most people vote for a dream, but keeping things pretty much the way they are. Because if we were voting for change, we wouldn't have the current political representation that we have in the country throughout. We would have dynamic, young, aggressive thinkers at the head of our political parties. We don't. So in fact, the difficult reality is the people that we vote in, we actually vote in with a mandate not to change things too much. And that's maybe part of the problem.
Thanks, Dion. Which comes back to fear, the fear of change, the fear of risks. We have to face these risks. And you talked about being kept awake at night. What are the possible future risks that keep you three awake at night? You know, we've seen here that government is seen as a risk, but and we've seen the compounded impact of taxi violence, a pandemic, drought, fire, cyber attack. You know, what should we be looking out for and putting on our radars, and what can we do about it? Let's go back to you, Gareth.
Thanks for the question. So I mean, our first point I want to obviously emphasize there is I mean, I think the compounding risks are mostly what keeps me up at night. And I think there is generally a large amount of governance risk in South Africa at this particular time as well. But possibly to add a new one into the mix that hasn't been mentioned, because it's important, I think, also obviously to speak more about the technological changes in our society, is I do worry about the growing extent of cyber risk in our society, and by extent in our city as well. I mean, larger institutions are increasingly being attacked and poses particular risks, around data, privacy, loss of reputation. But in many respects, larger cities, of course, have built the required firewalls. Technology changes obviously quicker, and staying up to speed with that is important. And I mean, in one of the key investments that the city of Cape Town is making over the course of the next 4 or 5 years is a significant overhaul of its own internal structures, because there's a significant risk with legacy technology and legacy hardware, and it has also becomes obviously a barrier to innovation. And so getting the right amount of combination of storage and hardware with storage and cloud all relates to obviously protecting against cyber risk, and it becoming increasingly a barrier to change. It's a significant investment. But I worry as well about the broader societal impacts of cyber attack, and particularly to small businesses. I mean, the studies show that more than 50% of small businesses hit by a significant cyber attack will never recover. And so it's important, obviously, to think about the whole system, because, of course, coming together, this is a big delivery chain of people delivering services and goods to each other, to government, and the like. And so thinking more critically about the risk of cyber, it's often too late, when, of course, people do respond to the need to improve systems and responses. A sort of broader societal response to cyber, I think, is going to have to be a risk that is increasingly taken on, and arguably taken on together as well. I think particularly about thousands of suppliers to government on databases as well, and the extent to which there's safety there. Of course, we must worry about ourselves, but we also have to think through the whole system consequences. So that's a risk that is increasingly, I'm starting to think about, that it needs a collective response.
Thanks, Gareth. Ellen, anything keeping you awake?
There's lots keeping me awake at night, Jill. I think that what keeps me awake at night is the continued community unrest that is going to take place. Things may seem quiet in the country because they're not making headline news, but there's a lot simmering in our country. And I suppose if you look at the demographics of, just for example, Atlantis, and the compound effect as you speak about, yeah, I worry about that, and just how much longer it will take to recover, if we ever recover. So for me, it's our slow response to the simmering unrest. It seems like we always need a crisis to get into action, yet we are living in the crisis. And so that's something that frustrates me, and it's something that keeps me awake at night. Yeah.
Thanks, Ellen. Dion, you've flagged government as one of our biggest risks. Can I put another question to you, which is, how do we deal with the need to pivot quickly when we have different systems operating, civil society and the private sector, community organizations are able to act quickly, and government tends to be a bit slower? What are your thoughts on this?
Well, you're actually, it's telepathy. You're actually paraphrasing my fear. And my fear is that if we cannot change in a controlled, systematic, predictable manner, then society will change for us. And my industry works it takes you, commercial buildings, it takes you around about 11 years to pay off your building before you even start making profit. Industrial slightly less, but it is in that decade environment. So my industry, although I'm advocating for change, ironically, we also need line of sight for at least a decade, preferably two. And the fear that I have is if we don't use the window to constructively change, then society will change for us, as we've recently seen in KZN and Gauteng. And that is probably the most disruptive thing that can possibly happen in my world, right? Because why would anybody put bricks and mortar in the ground knowing that there could be another KZN? Okay, so that is my fear, is when change happens so quickly that it's a fundamental disruption. It's the old story, it's an oil tanker. You turn the tiller at about 3 or 4 degrees, right? And it takes an oil tanker around about an hour and a half to do a 360-degree turn. If you turn that tiller at 10 or 15 degrees, even if it's chugging along at about 10 or 12 knots, it's going to capsize. And that is my world. My world is one that is a slow-moving world. It takes time to build buildings. It takes time to put in infrastructure. But if the change is too quick and too disruptive at a societal level, then my world will sink, right? So paraphrasing your what you said yourself, Joel, is we need government to now set the course. We need government, right? My world does need government because government creates the playing field. It creates the stability that most of the private sector needs to be able to do their magic in. But when government is a liability, i.e. when government becomes the biggest risk, then there's a crisis. So I'm not debating or advocating for a revolution against national, provincial, or local. I'm saying, guys, let's use this crisis to slick down to core business. And the Constitution gives us the core business in a very, very elegant way. Let's just dare to ask ourselves, what additionally are we doing over and above that is actually causing this dead weight? And if we can have that frank discussion, and if society can start voting in people who understand the core business as per the Constitution, well, I think we're going to see magic in this country.
Thanks, Dion. What we all seem to agree on is that there's a need for change and a shifting of mindset and collaboration. And I suppose one of the last questions I have for you three panelists is learning from the pandemic, where we saw civil society and the private sector moving quickly to respond to the pandemic and food relief, for example. Government acting more slowly, but then turning up to have difficult conversations about how to collaborate. And we've seen that in our work with the Western Cape Food Forum, very effective conversations between public, private, and civil society leading to action. And it sounds to me like that's what we need here as well. What are the lessons from that you feel we can take forward? Where to from here, in other words? We've had comments in the chat. People want to be involved in this change. Where do we take this conversation? Should we go back to you, Gareth?
Thanks for the question, Joel. I mean, let me give one answer, which I found very instructive from working inside this big super tanker. Because I think it's an important learning as well for periods going forward. So, people say we're always living in crisis. I don't want to live in crisis all the time. Nobody wants to live in crisis. But one thing that I found useful, that I lived through and that I was part of at a very senior level, of course, was that when the pandemic hit, And let's just say that is analogous to the various crises, for example, that Dion has raised, which I agree with. I mean, we inside the city government obviously found ourselves, at the start, February last year, you've established organogram, and what we, for this particular event, did is we broke that organogram for the response to the pandemic. We've entirely broke it. And many people wouldn't know it. We created an entirely new system of strategizing, implementing, and running the projects in order to respond to that pandemic, with regular lines of accountability. And it was impactful, and it worked basically off of the back of superb project management. People given the luxury and freedom to work and collaborate across what commonly would be regarded to as silos was obviously a massively refreshing thing to do, with less fear about obviously getting things wrong. And so the pandemic structure that was set up was an incredible thing to work in. And I think that is, as I said, if we could make these other crises analogous to this, breaking structures down that don't work is incredibly important. And that's a very practical thing which I have taken out of this particular thing. We didn't do as much of that during the drought shock. And so I'd like to see more of that going on in the future. But the other point I wanted to make as well was more of a personal one, I think it is instructive around the collaboration that happened around food security during the pandemic, and which is an ongoing issue, and which has a range of new action steps as well. And I have seen obviously the tentativeness which government came to some of those discussions from a very, very active civil society space. Trusted partners obviously improved those particular spaces. And it did take considerable vulnerability in order to come into those spaces and to obviously ask for help and to accept that this is a very, very big problem that certainly didn't actually have very much of a government solution at all. It required a lot more. And that's hard. Many government officials find that type of work very, 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 very difficult. It's not an excuse. It needs to be better. It needs to be a hell of a lot better. But there is a need for a great amount of vulnerability, and a lot more government officials obviously need to learn this particular skill in order to go into conversations that don't always have to be difficult, but increasingly are difficult. And I think that there are a lot of people have been beaten back, certainly in government over time, possibly through their own fault, possibly because the wrong capabilities and skills. But the ability to obviously authentically engage and to engage with vulnerability is one of those steps towards the word we heard earlier, which is collaboration. And so getting over those kinds of fears and getting to those kinds of periods where there's collaborative stuff, I'm not saying is easy, has to be done. But that's one of my learnings as well from the pandemic. It's a previous learning from the drought as well. And I think, as I said in my early things, it's not just about the acute shocks. Many of these things just become chronic stresses in our society. And so, the extent to which we might be able to surge and respond to acute shocks actually has to become more of a way of being in order to responding to the chronic stresses, which in all due respect, and everyone has said it on this call, classed in another way actually are acute shocks. I mean, high unemployment is a stress, but when you've got 28% unemployment, is that not actually just an ongoing shock event? So thanks for the question.
Thanks, Gareth. I'm very conscious of the time. We started out this conversation thinking about risk and who bears the cost. And so when we saw protests, the cost to the country as a result of protests and the taxi violence and all these risks that we've seen, who bears the cost? Well, we do. And there's no one going to come rushing in to save us. And I think that from this conversation, it's clear that we need to collaborate. We need to have those conversations and to treat all partners equally, and tackle this together. And our best insurance against risk is to do that ahead of time. So we need to build those relationships now. And I think as a next step, coming back to Dion, no one's asked you, that's the relationship building that we need to do. It's the relationship building that Ellen is doing with communities. It's the work that Gareth is doing, building capabilities within that tanker that he referred to. We've come to the end of our time. I'd like to thank our 3 panelists and for all of you for participating. We will have another Futurecasting event in November, so I'd urge you to join us. But please keep in touch with us and let's take this conversation further. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you, colleagues. Thank you, Dion and Ellen.